any diplomat or anyone who has traveled a lot or who cares about international relations, borders are an endlessly fascinating subject. And one of my favorite parts in my diplomatic work has been going to borders and watching how the flow of people and goods and cultures go back and forth. And of course, borders enrich us by setting boundaries, by differentiating us, and indeed coming from a country that is based on immigration and migration. Certainly one of our greatest strengths is the diversity that has come from migration. At the same time, migration and immigration are also issues that are incredibly polemic and incredibly political that also divide the country. So it's a really challenging topic, and I wish that I had been here to hear everything that you've heard so far today. You have a very distinguished panel, and I'm very grateful for all of you being here and taking on these topics. I wish I could stay with you the whole day and listen. In any case, it's a great topic. And then, of course, as we look at borders and what crosses borders and what doesn't respect borders, for example, conflict and climate change and pandemics and things like that, it raises a whole lot of other issues. And we have to rethink about whether borders that have been set under certain circumstances still make sense in this world. And so we have a lot of topics to take on. When it comes to the current situation, we're going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine and how migration is affecting us given the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, you have to think about the difference between the different types of migration, refugees, migrants, how those flows move and why, what motivates them. And then, of course, how those are received. And for me, this has also raised some really difficult questions. Watching over the last few months how Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed, which is a wonderful thing and very important, and we should welcome refugees. But why aren't all refugees welcomed that way? And it's the case in Europe, but it's also the case in the United States. And that's a real challenge. And I think we need to do some reflection on that. So important to see and think about all these different ideas. Also, what do we do about now? Of course, we have this question of with a mobilization and a forced mobilization of troops in Russia, people who are fleeing that situation. How do you qualify those people? And should they be welcomed or not? I think it brings up a lot of very complex emotions and questions for all of us. So I look forward to hearing what people have to say about that. And it is a particularly political question for us at home today. And I think we expected it to actually show up more in our midterm elections. And I don't think it was as defining an issue as we might have expected. People, of course, in elections tend to be occupied with the most daily things, which is, of course, inflation, affordability, jobs, and things like that. But it certainly will continue as the conflict goes on and people continue moving because of the conflict. How you deal with the refugees? How do you deal with the countries who are hosting the refugees at their cost? Who should bear the cost? What happens to the children? So I look forward to hearing everything that you have to say. All of you are going to become, or you already are, leaders and decision makers and activists and active citizens. And so these questions are going to be important for you now and in your future. The questions may shift and they may transform as they have over the last few decades, but they won't go away. And I think the key point right here in this room is that we do need to tackle them together because borders will continue to pose all kinds of different challenges. And what we've seen through the past, and I think what we'll continue to see in the future, is that especially when those of us on both sides of the Atlantic who share values work together to tackle these cross-border issues, we're definitely stronger and we get a much better outcome. So with that, thank you for your investment in the topic and thank you for your investment in the relationship. And again, it's an honor to be here.
Everybody, even the people following the roundtable on their screen for this conversation, I would say, and this debate about border policies in the light of the Ukraine-Russian war. So it's quite an ambitious subject for 2 hours. I'm very pleased to share the direction of the roundtable with my friend Joachim Beck, and I'm very happy to welcome on this roundtable Katarzyna Stoklosa, from the University of Southern Denmark, Emmanuel Brunet-Jaly from the University of Victoria, and John Goodman, University of Syracuse in Strasbourg. Of course, we will hear to their analysis of this subject. I'm just reading the last book of Bertrand Badi and Dominique Vidal, which is named Le Monde ne sera plus comme avant. And the purpose of the book is quite interesting because we hear quite often that the war in Ukraine and its many consequences on borders is the repetition of history. It is things that we had before and that we might also have in the future. And their point is to take the opposite point of view. They defend the idea that we have to get out of this myth of the éternel retour. They try to concentrate their analysis on what is new after the war in Ukraine. And I think it's quite an interesting first question for the members of the panel. What is new in this war and its consequences? What is new in the sharing of the costs, as you have said, when you have a sudden flow of migrants and people who are staying for a while and then go back in Ukraine and maybe then will have to come back to some European countries because of the cold, of the winter, very simply. How can we qualify these migrants? Is it a new form of people seeking for asylum? We know that from a legal point of view, they are qualified a little bit in between. They deserve a specific protection, but a provisional protection. And do we face new standards of management of borders because of this war? Or is it sort of ancient solutions? Because the member states always have the same feeling in case of war. They feared a certain number of things, and one of the things we know is that when people, member states or citizens fear movements, they have as a sort of first reaction, the first reaction is to close border. At least that's what we faced during the pandemic. It's not the same thing with the war in Ukraine. And my question is it really new, or is it just that considering the links some member states, European member states had with Ukraine, is it just something deriving from the specific history or something else? So maybe what I will do is that I will just follow the program and first give the floor to Katarzyna, then to Emmanuel Jaly, and then to John Goodman.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this very fascinating panel. Thank you for the invitation to the conference theater. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for very fascinating and broad questions. And I think we could discuss for hours. And I'm curious whether we be the same opinion or whether perhaps we could develop some controversial discussion between us. And I will start answering your questions. What is new? Is this war, and I'm not saying the war, the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukrainian-Russian war, I don't like this term. And this is very clear, a war against Ukraine. This is a Russian war, aggression against Ukraine. This is what we observe. Is this war new? No. Some aspects are new. And from this perspective, I agree with the thesis that we can observe something new, but on the other hand, we can observe repetition, the repetition of a terrible war, something that we, perhaps not personally, but people experienced during the Second World War. And even worse, we can observe very many methods, brutal methods, from the First World War. Something that 1 year ago we thought will not be possible as such methods. Something will not be possible in Europe. But yes, we observe very many terrible methods. And for us historians, it's something that we cannot understand how this would happen. But of course, we experience new aspects too. And one of the very important new aspects is that we don't know what will happen. We are not prepared, although we have made this experience with many different wars. But we experience completely new movements of people, of migrants. And has been your second question. How can we qualify these migrants that are coming now to Europe? How can we qualify them? This is a very different movement, very different from refugee crisis 2015. Ukrainian migrants, we can classify them as people who are in Europe, very many European countries, although they don't want to be here, they want to be at home, and they didn't plan to come to Europe. It was different in case of refugee movements 2015. Now you could argue, no, very many didn't want to come. But yes, many planned to come, and they came because of different reasons, because of the war, but because of economic reasons. And most of them wanted to stay and want to stay. And this is different in case of Ukrainian refugees. They don't want to stay in our countries, although in most cases they are welcome. But they weren't prepared. They had houses, they work, most of them stable economic situation in Ukraine, and from one day to another, they had to change their whole life. So this is different. And your third question, what will happen to borders? In my opinion, we experience very dangerous phenomenon. What we experience in Europe now is the danger that the status quo of borders built after the Second World War, something stable, something we thought, yes, this is what characterizes Europe. We have the status quo, and the borders will not change anymore in Europe. And now, this is not the reality anymore. This is a myth. The myth that, yes, is already the past. What we experience now is the danger that all borders, not only Ukrainian Russian border, but when we observe and analyze discussions and analysis in Central Eastern European countries, we are afraid and very realistic. Baltic countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Romania, Moldova, they are afraid the borders can change too. And what is? We can observe that these border changes have been accepted by some other, we have to say, non-democratic countries for the moment, keyword Hungary. Viktor Orban would like change certain parts of borders to certain parts of former Hungarian territories and include them from the Ukrainian state. This is why Viktor Orban supports Russian war. And this is why Viktor Orban didn't want to go to Ukraine and to give a sign to show solidarity with Ukraine. So the sort of acceptance and the sort of solidarity inside of non-democratic part of Europe is very dangerous.
So I haven't read the book by the end, so I couldn't, but I actually agree with them. I think that what the Russian-Ukraine war is bringing together today is a realization of something that we've already discussed in the literature, and that becomes, in a way, a social science data in the 1970s, which is this: state-to-state wars are exceptions. And that, especially since the Second World War, they've nearly completely disappeared. And I insist on this, it is mostly for the students, by the way. State-to-state wars do not exist anymore. When you look at the Correlate of War database, which has collected every single instance of war since 1820, you have more than 800 case studies. And you have, I was looking because I wrote on this a few years ago, in French, by the way, so it's an article that you can find in French. There are 770 cases that are wars, but internal to members of the international communities. The other cases are the exceptions. So it's very, very, very important to realize the outrage in the international community since the Second World War, because we know that we cannot intervene when a state is very oppressive with its own regions, its own borderland, its own citizens. It's one of the principles, right? It's respect of sovereignty, non-ingérence en français, it's non-ingérence. Et c'est le respect de la souveraineté, which are two pillars of, I would say, international politics today. But when you look at the work, and you know, I can give the citation for the purpose of the Singer and Small 1972 is the first book published on the state of war today in the world. And Sarpi published in 2000 exactly as well. And when you look at this data, you must be confounded that, you know, there are no more. Now, most of those 30 cases that I'm talking, it's actually a bit more than 30, because we have more than 800 cases. But even if we were to say, well, we have 100 cases of state-to-state war since the 1820s, these are an exception. They're a tiny little proportion of the overall data. It's about 48 cases overall. And what we have, however, and I want to insist on this, we have a discovery in the 1970s that there are wars today in the world because of issues of border, because of issues of minorities claiming rights, claiming, in a way, self-determination. And self-determination is a principle that made the international community laugh in the 1920s, especially during the negotiation of the Treaty of Paris and Versailles in 1919. But not since the Second World War. It's the principle that has dictated, in a way, the whole work around decolonization that was managed by the UN since the 1950s. It's actually the big successful mandate that the UN has had since its creation, working with decolonized countries towards becoming members of the international community. So if you look at, for instance, the international community membership inside the UN, you realize that the number of states at the creation of the UN were about 60 ballpark, and now with more than 3 times as many, right? 192 that are formally members with full rights. And if you add all of the other ones, including the ones who have auditor status, like Palestine, like the EU, and the EU has more than just auditor status, and so on and so forth, you're maybe at 210 or 250 members over. So it's very important to realize this outrage. But also what's important to me is to understand why it's such an outrage. It's that the international community without war is touched because the international community, Western world is touched, right? It's the first time that you have such an instance that is basically looking at the former colons, the former powers that have controlled and set up the system, right? Set up the post-Second World War institution and put them in place, that they have one of their closest members, somebody who was, so close to having NATO status, that has actually negotiated to become a member of a peace bloc. By the way, remember that NATO is actually formed to maintain and enforce peace within its members. It's very important to realize this too. And so, my point is that, yes, it's making all of these members of NATO realize that this is still possible for certain members of the country. Russia, China, today others, but Russia, China. So where is this coming from? And why is it that we're in this situation? I think is another question, which is really, really important. So if we look at, what's about the cost, issue of immigration, issue of energy, well, I think another issue which we do not discuss very much is the fact that these members of the international communities that realize that there are wars within members of the international community, and that's a huge issue today, took it for granted. And so in a way, it's not going to be the same ever again, because everybody is in a way realizing that we have to possibly create institutions or mechanisms which we do not have to enforce this onto members of the international communities that will not want to respect. So I totally agree. It's a very Second World War reaction what the Russians have done. You don't walk in a state like this and claim territory. That's something that was done in the 1700s, 1800s, and the last empire that tried to do this was the German Empire, under the Nazis. And that was unique in a way, right? And it's been written and documented, and this idea that you could just take over states, and even theoretically, there are books on the philosophy of war, on the ethics of war, and so on and so forth. And almost every thinker disagrees with the idea that that invasion is actually acceptable. There are many other reasons, but invasion is almost never, ever justified. Why are we there? We are there because minorities and nations, and I insist on the word nations. Nations defined as, in a way, communities that have self-determination claims, have become prominent in the way we discuss all kinds of international issues. Right? The human rights discussion that we have, for instance, in case of development, social and economic development, is participating in these discussions. We have developed a legal system to actually protect minorities and nations. And the idea is to evolve towards peace maintaining mechanisms across the world that allow for states to manage claims of minorities and nations. It doesn't happen very easily, but certainly we are at that threshold today. And certainly the case of Ukraine has, put on the table. So I don't know where the international community is going, but I know that the institutions we have, the International Court of Justice, for instance, and the Peace Corps of the UN and all these bodies are not equipped with this. They're well equipped to help state decolonize, but they're not well equipped to tell a member of the international community, even the Security Council, is not well equipped to say to one of its members, you absolutely cannot do this. tell Russia, tell China. The members of the Security Council and the decisions, as you've seen discussed in the UN, as you've read speeches. I don't know if you have, you should definitely do it. You realize that, you know, a lot of members outside of the Security Council now are really raising the questions. And so it's a very big debate. So the world will not be the same anymore because it's in a way an unhinged world, right? It's completely changing the way we see the future. And I think it's a reason to believe, or at least to have hope, that we develop new institutions that will be actively maintaining peace. And also probably, you know, resources and so on and so forth that will help states, and I mean networks of states organized to maintain peace on their territory. I will discuss this a bit more tomorrow in terms of what it means for border, because it has a huge impact on the security of the and thank you for that.
Thank you, Manuel. John.
So I think first thing I would say is that we're kind of discussing this topic on a cold, dark night in Strasbourg, but it's really a very visceral topic. And I think it's important to kind of realize that, of course, people are being bombarded as we speak, people are being shot and wounded as we speak. And so it's not just an academic debate. These really important issues take really the utmost seriousness. So I really thank the group for organizing the panel and for allowing space for these discussions. Second thing I'd say is that with all due respect, I actually don't think that there is a global outrage about the war in Ukraine. I think there's European outrage about the war in Ukraine. But if we look at just something very indicative like, or perhaps not indicative, like UN General Assembly votes, I mean, large parts of Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America do not feel particularly concerned by the war in Ukraine if it were not for the food situation. But they're not in a rush to condemn the situation. And I'd rather say or submit that they're acting as a kind of jury to see and holding their verdict pending the development of events, which raises the stakes even further for the situation. So I do want to try to answer the question about what's new. I think the following things are new. I think this is, of course, a new challenge for the transatlantic relationship, and it's particularly a challenge because the whole shift of momentum and attention was towards East Asia, and somehow this has pulled the attention back, and that's a different situation than a transatlantic or Euro-Atlantic relationship during the Cold War, for instance, that was very Eurocentric. It was about Berlin, it was about Germany, it was about Eastern Europe. This is a transatlantic test, while there's another huge challenge in a different part of the world, and that is a new shape, I think, to this conflict. The second new thing, I think, is the scale of destruction in Ukraine. I mean, as the war goes on, we are talking about almost the complete destruction of cities, almost like Germany post-World War II. I mean, where cities are completely leveled. I mean, that is a level of destruction and displacement that follows that, you know, Europe has rarely seen since the Second World War, if ever. How will that be paid for? How will it be undertaken? I think that is new. Now, Ukraine was, of course, very much affected by the famine in the 30s, the political famine, as they call it, and was affected by the German occupation. But this is on a whole nother level, I think. Third, I think there's a new question of the border, since that's a specific question. I mean, where is Ukraine actually going to get back the Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea? And if it doesn't, when does the war end? And I think that's a new question. The next new question for me is, let's say in the best case scenario, or we can say end scenario, where Ukraine is victorious and then proceeds to join on a path to join NATO or eventually the European Union. where does that leave Russia? On the outside of this enormous bloc and having been defeated in a war. I mean, that kind of reminds me of the Franco-Prussian War or the First World War, where you are setting up the scene for another conflict of some kind. And if Russia were to be victorious, then what does it mean for the future of European integration? Right, where a democratic state has been stopped in its trajectory. So these are really difficult and new questions. I do think some questions are, have good historical parallels. One, the defense of sovereignty. I mean, that's the norm that's just been laid out. I mean, you can make a very clear, well, I don't know clear, but I hope this is not overstating it, but I mean, others have done this, comparing Czechoslovakia in 1939 and Ukraine today, right? So you're having a very simple question of defense of sovereignty. That's a persistent historical question. And I think likewise, this test of values, right? You do have a test of values. And that's when I was talking about the jury early on. So I'll just add this one other point, which is not directly connected to the question, but I do think is important. And particularly for European audience, there's and then when I talked about this being a very visceral topic, so if you've ever read an American scholar named Timothy Snyder, he's written many books, but the most famous one is called Bloodlands. If you read him on this Ukraine issue, I mean, he is completely informed by his reading of the history of the region and absolutely adamant about resisting the Russian invasion tooth and nail, and fully supportive of the Ukrainians. But you can read another very influential American international relations scholar named John Mearsheimer, who is highly critical of the European Union, the United States, in this conflict. And I think for the moment, Mearsheimer's view is completely obscured, but I'm not convinced that it will remain obscured as things evolve. And so I really counsel people to read his view. I think it reflects views of other people who are not getting very much media attention or getting very much attention in policy circles, but it's there. And when events or circumstances evolve, it could easily return. And that would have really significant impact on the way we think about and what happens in Ukraine. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think Katarina likes to react. It's a very good point.
Because you have a very good point, and I agree. There's no global awareness or even knowledge about the war in Ukraine, and something that's so for sure to us. We experience it's not the most important or one of the most important topics for other regions in the world. And in the last period, I have participated in very similar talks in Mexico or Thailand, but not physical, unfortunately, about crisis, about global crisis. And what I could see is that the war against Ukraine doesn't belong to global crisis from the perspective of Southern Americans or people in Thailand. Although, of course, it is and has consequences. Yes, and the key word is hunger. But it hasn't been perceived as global crisis in other regions, other continents. But we don't have to talk about a global perception. Let's have a look at Europe. There are completely different perceptions of this crisis, of the war against Ukraine. And if you ask a Polish or Baltic countries' politicians, they would say that Germans are naive and don't have an idea, and German reactions towards Putin and Russia are completely are not understandable. So there are completely different perceptions and opinions inside of Europe. And for this reason, we don't have to, to be astonished that we don't have similar perceptions from the global point of view. But a very good point, yes.
Yeah. So it's not the world judging the West. When you look at the first UN resolution of the that was on the war of Ukraine, like 11.1 resolution 1, you have 96 states that are members of the United Nations that are sponsoring the resolution, and 141 states that vote in favor. You have 35 states that remain neutral, and the problem is within the 35 states, and 5 that vote against. 12 are not there, so these 12 are ambiguous. But I want to insist on this. For me, this is extremely, extremely important, right? It's really important to realize 141 states are definitely against that war, whether they're internal politics or not, play differently, and that includes all of the members of the European Union. All of the members of the European Union voted in favor of that resolution. That includes Hungary and Poland, for instance, right? So it's very important to see this. The problem that we have, which has been highlighted many times, is in terms of world population, 2 of the largest states, India and China, remain neutral. Both India and China have issues with their peripheries. And we tend to focus on Taiwan, but the real problem in China is not Taiwan. The real problem in China is the periphery of China, continental periphery of China, right? And the camps that you have in Western China, where you have 2 million people who are being re-educated. So that's a huge, huge issue. And for India, the problem is Kashmir and Jammu, which together are 55 million people, 54 million people that live under a state of emergency continually. You cannot leave your house at night. And the Indian military is there to monitor. Security governments have been banned, and the elite have been put in jail, opposition doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. Right, so these are very, very serious issues. The case of China, I would say, is very specific to China. The case to India, unfortunately, is a situation for these 2 areas that started in 1947, basically. Pre-existed, right? And since then has become in a way worse. And that also, I would say, is the case of Kashmir, especially Kashmir, Little West Jammu, is directly related to issues of control of energy, because there is clear water coming down from the Himalaya that India cannot dispense with. Okay? And who controls the water, where the dams are, is high up in the river, and the river is, and then the problem is that, this huge watershed used to be the wealthiest region in the world. It's been divided between India and Pakistan. As you probably know, some of you, this border has probably the worst possible border policies that we have. 600 kilometers are shoot to kill. The other one is a ditch for about 700 kilometers. And so when you have a shoot, that on the Bangladeshi, for instance, border, you don't even have a shoot to kill policy, but only 600 kilometers to Pakistan you do. And then north of this, you've got Jammu and Kashmir. And so these are very specific issues, right? But the problem with this is that India and China, plus the other members, 33 members that voted neutral in case of this revolution, form a majority of people in the world.
I'd like to pick up an argument earlier which you stated, Emmanuel. You asked for new mechanisms for peace. And I'd like to focus a little bit on this dimension, and I'd like to raise the question to all the panelists about what is the right level? Is it a purely European or primarily European issue that we should reflect on, maybe not peace, but we should reflect on new mechanisms, referring to the German mechanism of European integration, asking for new mechanisms of internal management of consequences of such policies. That was one dimension. Then, on a broader issue, we have the United Nations, and we cannot avoid the conflict. But how can we maybe introduce new mechanisms of preventive action at that level? This raises the issue of the power of the international cooperation system in relation to individual states that just simply want to respect the rules that we have, or have other strategies which are maybe not so much on the platform. The question is, what is the right level and what are the right mechanisms that we could reflect a little bit on this issue? And who wants to maybe I start with
Sure.
John?
I'll do my best. I mean, I think that reform of the UN Security Council is really perennially on the table and perennially difficult. And I don't know what states' attitudes will be after this conflict. I don't know if it's enough to change attitudes about India having a place, about Germany having a place, about Brazil having a place. I don't know if this war is significant enough to change, the entrenched attitudes and interests in those calculations. So in terms of UN, I confess not to have any particular answers or proposals. On the other hand, at the European level, I do tend to think that some very hard thinking needs to be done about what basically I would call the post-war security architecture looks like. And that thinking has actually probably started or part of the negotiations that end this war in whatever form it takes. One of the results of the negotiations that end the war, and there will be negotiations no matter what, will probably be I hope to be the beginnings or the roots of some type of new security architecture in Europe. The model that immediately comes to mind, which is without any deep reflection on my part, is the Helsinki Accords, right? So the Helsinki Accords and détente, of course, tricky issue in Germany at the time, but still are about a European organization in which the Soviet Union and the United States and the European countries were all on equal footing, more or less, to discuss issues. And currently that doesn't exist, except for, it used to exist at the Council of Europe prior to the expulsion of Russia. As far as I know, there's not an organization currently in which Russia participates and I'm not a European specialist, but that's my sense of things. And I don't want to overstate things, and it's not my particular area of expertise, but from today's vantage point, you can't help but think, at least I cannot help but think that, and this was probably overgeneral, and forgive me, but we cannot really say that the management of the Russian Federation post the collapse of the Soviet Union is essentially a failure. And if we look at it from today, like, it has not succeeded. I mean, Russia is neither a democracy, it's kind of a market economy with issues. And it's an aggressive military actor in different realms. So somewhere along the way, either on the Russian side or the Western side, it went astray. And not placed to analyze, who and why. But in any case, it's not been successful. And there's a need to rethink that. And I think for young people and for everybody, a lot of creativity is required to think about what would be a new potential architecture.
I like it now because I think now it's the point that we start to have some controversial opinions. Yes. One point I agree, we have to look for some new mechanism, but I say no discussions and no thinking about peace without Ukrainian agreement and without Ukrainian yes. So no discussions, no conversation with terrorists, Yes, he want Russia. So I'm very clear with this point. And you mentioned the tone. Yes, some months ago, I was very much convinced regarding the tone and Willy Brandt and the policy towards Eastern Europe. Now I'm very much more skeptical because the tone was a very clear policy supporting in that time Soviet Union interests and not so much other Eastern European countries' interests. And now when I compare the new Russian politics, Russian-German relations, I have discovered very many similarities.
Mr. Vladimir Putin, he wants to talk to you. The red phone, exactly. The red phone.
Yes, coming back to not so nice topics, but yes, when we compare German and Russian relations today and German interests, we can see very many similarities between the tone from 70s and pro-Soviet interests with Russian interests and Germany today. So I don't think a possible the tone could be a further development and an option for a future peace. But we need, of course, a post-war security architecture. Why? Because we will experience, in my opinion, a frozen war. The war will not be finished. The war against Ukraine. And this is something we experience in other parts of the world. And one example is Azerbaijan, Armenia. And we have to deal, unfortunately, with this situation. And for this reason, yes, we need mechanism, we need an option. And this is for the moment my future project. I'm working on a future option for this border region and for future Europe, but I don't have an answer, unfortunately, how this would look like. So I can't offer you any concrete answer.
So, peace, right? So there are, in my mind, there are two forms. Probably the one that is the lowest hanging fruit, in other words, the most likely to happen, is an expansion of NATO. And I think a strengthening of the relationship between the EU and EU member states, NATO and the US. I wrote a paper last summer on the relationship between Canada, the US, and the European Union, in which I say that what I find fascinating is Canada and the US have always had a privileged relationship since the Second World War, very, very close, soft diplomacy at all levels of government. And this is now happening with the European Union, beyond, in a way, the negotiation, difficult with the US, very easy with Canada, of treaties that would include trade. So the CETA with Canada, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, will probably have, a sister treaty or brother treaty with the US. And the US and the EU are really working quite hard. At least that's what I hear on the Canadian side, because they're observers. But what I think is most important is the development of very regular, very close relationships. The problem in the US, excuse me on this, is their very polarized view of that relationship within the different political parties, the Democrat, and especially within the Republican Americans, you have people who are against points of the US as support of Ukraine today. It's a minority in the Republican Party, but it illustrates that polarization. And so if you have somebody like Trump in power in the future, what I'm saying becomes, completely rewritten. So I want to say this, I think that relationship is based on values, and the values have, in a way, inspired for much more institutionalization of the relationship with treaties of all kinds, cultural, economic, social, and so on and so forth, that are coming closer and closer. And I think the lowest hanging fruit would be an extension of NATO. We have it happening in Europe, with neutral states becoming members of NATO. So that's a very strong point, but also the extension of NATO on the other side of the world, the part of the world where you have lots of people who remain neutral, and I'm thinking, especially Japan and South Korea. So it's not inside the UN, but it's a very important association and peacemaking body that could expand. And again, it's a peacemaking body. It's very important. It's not a war machine, right? It's a solidarity again among states that would provide peace across the world. I think that Russia is the Iran of yesterday. And I think Russia will become a pariah state in two different ways. First of all, contrary to what a lot of people think, Russia doesn't work very well, especially when you look at, for instance, if you look at the side of Russia that is close to China, you realize that there are lots of indigenous population, community population that are now politically structured. So at the time of the Soviet Union, you had, and I'm doing research on this right now, but you had about 20 or so indigenous political communities that were structured. They had their own governments, they had their own independence, their own charters or constitution, if you want, and they had some independence including fiscal independence from the Soviet Union. Now in Russia, that number has maybe doubled or tripled. There are many more indigenous communities, especially along all of the stand states, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth, that have asked for independence, and certainly on the China front, on the North Korean front, and all that region in the way. You have lots of indigenous communities that have asked for this similar status. So if you look at this from the power of the Russian state, you can see a fragmentation on the eastern side of that country. And you can see that there are lots of minority population that do not want to serve in the country. I think this is only being polarized. They find peaceful way to kind of disengage with the Russian system. So it's a pariah state in that way. And I think even though Russia is oil and gas powerful, and India, for instance, and China are dependent, they will have a relationship with Russia that is that of, in a way, certainly with China, in my mind, it will be a relationship of empire, of economic empire. We will own what we pay. And I think the Chinese especially are very good at this. They will want to control, as they do, for instance, in Angola, their access to resources. They will buy the land, they will privatize and harvest under Chinese systems, how oil, gas, mines are being harvested in Russia. The relationship with India is more complex, but closely. So I think the future of peace might just happen with NATO first, and then let's see how this can be changed at the level of the UN. I agree actually, that inside the UN it's much more complex, but there could be a widening of the Security Council, for instance. That would be an option, at least that's the option. The last thing I want to say on peace is this. I think the Ukrainian will win the war. And I'm not saying it just because we're in Europe. I'm saying this because there are high-level officials, military, for instance, generals from the US that have publicly spoken on this and written on this. And so when you look at like the elite of US Army looking at the Ukraine war, they think that is possible. Like I was listening to a podcast published in The Economist just last month, where you have one of the most respected general in the US Army who's saying that he can see the strategy in place right now, put in place by the Ukraine win by the summer. Win by the summer. He says that Europeans have said that the Ukrainians were to disengage this winter, and he says that every single move by the Ukrainian army shows that they're not disengaging, and that every Russian move shows that they're just biding time. I'm not a military specialist, but I read these people, and I read very carefully, and I listen to what they say. And I think, if you have these people who are thinking it, they have more information than we do to believe this. Why would they say it? Their credibility is at stake.
It's a question of military and economic capacity. Very simply, and if you take the GDP of Russia, it's the equivalent of Spain, economically speaking. It's strategic, very important, element, gas and oil, but militarily, there's a huge coordination as far as I observe it amongst European member states. They don't talk about it in the newspaper every day, but if you look behind a little bit, it's a very close cooperation that we have, also with the American partners. So they put in all they have. This is why Ukraine's made 60 to win. The question is what is happening after that. And personally, I would also ask what could be a post-Biden. That's really a big issue for me. But you wanted to react?
Yeah, well, this is a good question. I think the first thing, the post-Biden perspective is a good one. The first thing is to remember that that Donald Trump refused to sell weapons to Zelensky because Zelensky would not provide information about Hunter Biden in the campaign. This is the same personalities 6 or 8 years ago.
Yes, John, but how much money has been committed now to the Ukraine war by the US, by Biden, the Biden administration?
Well, it was in my talk this morning.
So billions of dollars.
Yes, the questions are related to whatever Congress can do, Congress can undo. This is one. I want to just go back to the other point, and then I'll speak about the post-Biden, which is, because I just want to be clear about what I'm saying about the post-war new security architecture. And I think this is the big question which has to be asked. Does the post-war security architecture, which one assumes has to come, is it dependent on the return of Crimea to Ukraine? Does Ukraine have to have all of its territory back before you can discuss the new security architecture? Because if that's the case, and Ukraine does not get back all of its security, all of its previous territory, then the new security architecture is indefinitely postponed. It's indefinitely postponed. And maybe you have options like NATO expansion, but one has to ask whether that helps or hurts the security dynamic. I also have to express some skepticism about the withering away of Russia as a power. Yes, it's only 120 million people. By great power standards, is small, something like 120 million. Yes, the economy is a fraction of the European Union's economy, which is, of course, was the argument of Trump and also very serious conservative thinkers in the United States about the lack of military wherewithal in Europe. With such a massive economy, why was the United States subsidizing defense in Europe? And this was their argument. And I think it actually explains a lot of European confidence in the war, because when they look at the numbers, they figure that all the advantages are with Europe. But history tells me that, and I think this is really, really the most painful question, is that, of course, we know about Yalta from the name Yalta, We know it from the world. And we often forget that where is Yalta? It's in Crimea. The shadow of Yalta is like here. And this is your question, I think, is that will at some point, either Europeans or the Americans say that endless tension with Russia is not worth the Crimea? And what will that mean for Ukrainians? What will that mean for the reconstruction of Ukraine? And I think that it's a really important and mature dialogue to have with the Ukrainians, amongst ourselves, because the longer that there is the fantasy that this is all going to be won and Russia is going to wither or somehow as a great power or somehow transform quickly into a more cooperative partner, is kind of, unfortunate, I think, kind of fantasy. And I think that it, like all fantasies, it sets you up for a shock when the fantasy comes to reality. And I don't say that it's for tomorrow. I think the next election in the United States, Republican or Democrat, I don't know, I can't really say. I can't see the future, what impact it will have. But I think that it is a mistake to think that such solidarity, financial, military, in support of Ukraine is indefinite. That is, for me and for the Ukrainians, I think that's very, they must be thinking about it, which is, I suspect, why they're trying to move so fast while they haven't. But they also must know that it's like sand in a dial. At some point, could be 10 years or 15 years, they will say that this is not for the greater national interests of the Europeans and the Americans. Little bits of territory in Ukraine are not worth it. And that is maybe not Yalta in 1945, but it's some kind of version of Yalta. And I'm not saying that that will happen. I cannot see the future. I pray that we don't come to that circumstance. But we have to maintain that that is realistic. And I think in our public discourse about Ukraine, we're too shy and to discuss that and to face it clearly.
Yeah, I could imagine that we have maybe some people in the audience who would like to raise questions or comments.
Yes, I'm sorry, but I will think if a lawyer, as we say in French, but do you think that NATO and European continental countries and the United States are their part of responsibilities in the context of this conflict? Consider how they consider Russia during the 1990s when the United States were called the hyperpower by Mr. Vedrin, the former French Foreign Affairs Minister.
I mean, I can answer my answer in one sentence. You should watch the lecture on YouTube by John Mearsheimer, because this is the thesis which he has. I think he goes back to Budapest or Bucharest Summit 2004, in which Ukraine was given accession, whatever, I can't remember the terminology, partnership agreement, I think it was the terminology, with NATO. And Putin said at the very time, this is unacceptable to us. It was at the same time partnership agreements were given, I think is around the same time as the Georgian War. And his argument is that this was explicitly stated for more than a decade, that continuing on the path of NATO accession and or EU would provoke Russian aggression, and they proceeded. That's his argument. And he's a serious scholar. You can disagree with him or not, but it's worth listening to him, because as I'm saying earlier, I think his arguments are now in the shadows, but as time goes on, they may become stronger and stronger, whether he's right or not. And you can, if you go on YouTube, you will see, I think in line, a lot of very, very strong reactions to him. But let's just say he's someone who was against the Iraq War in the United States. He's very consistent in his thinking, and he's not a pacifist. He's a realist. But if you want to hear a very argument along that line, he's the most articulate thinker on that. So I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing him. I just, as an educational tool, I think it's important for you to listen to other voices.
You read of a footnote here, and what Ukrainian will not forget, the reason why they're not part of European Union and NATO is Germany and German reactions. Germany was against the Ukrainian NATO and EU membership, and Angela Merkel, yes, didn't agree, and very many countries, European countries, supported Ukrainian membership in the European Union, and Angela Merkel was against. And another footnote, just 1 day before the war, the German Chancellor visited Putin and gave the promise that under his government, yes, of Olaf Scholz, there will be no other NATO enlargement. And what do you think? What did Finland and Sweden think in this moment? Yes, so it was a moment of like Germany against NATO enlargement, just 1 day before the war. It was like, yes, from the Ukrainian perspective and from the Finnish perspective, a little bit naive and saying that the war will be not realistic. And 1 day later, it happened.
Yeah, for me, the way you should look at this is the way I discussed it earlier. Is I think minority communities and nations across the world are basically the issue of this century. They have been causing for more than 70 years lots of instability within states. The number of members of the United Nations keeps on increasing. It's not because of decolonization, it's because of secessions. These secessions can be managed peacefully. The international community has, in a way, to reconcile itself with that system. Yet, we have no institution to do this. I think the Ukraine war is kind of the hinge. It's like the issue is the boots, Russian boots in Ukraine. That's a huge, huge, huge issue for everybody. It's making it realize it's actually completely unacceptable. And so for me, that's a trigger. It becomes independent from the Ukraine war. It's a trigger for the long term. It's what is going to be, in a way, knocking at the international politics door until it's resolved. The Ukraine war is, in a way, the realization. How it will, end up is, in a way, a negotiation between China and the United States. That's the way I look at it. Russia, for me, has become a pariah state. It's become Iran or North Korea. It's become dependent on the protection of some other states, probably not India, as I said, probably the protection of China because of its resources. The problem it has, internal problem, is that it has already fragmented tremendously in the 1990s. And I see that, that ability, the military ability, as we have discussed already, the disconnect between GDP and war machine capacity has demonstrated that Russia doesn't have the power even they think they have. Their war machine was supposed to be the greatest war machine, and we see a small country back up. The other thing is very important. Look at the Ukrainian. That is a message for every single self-determining community in the world today. Tilly's argument in this regard is that war is the #1 factor for self-determination. It's well accepted. And Tilly's argument, in my mind, is what we see every day. You have Western Ukrainian fighting on the Eastern Front today. You have non-Russian, non-Tatar Ukrainian fighting on the eastern front, sorry, of Ukraine. You have here an exercise of, in a way, national self-determination. You have a cultural, linguistic, and religious division in that country that has been, in a way, washed away with the war, completely washed away. Every single nation across the world is looking at this today. Hence the 141 votes in the General Assembly. It's not a joke. This is it's obviously extremely painful, but it's an exemplar. It's the future, in a way, pathway. So the international community has to, look at this. And that's why I think, let's say, if we were to say this the next 10 years, you're going to see NATO expansion, and maybe in the next quarter century, you'll have peacemaking institutions. Why is it that the EU, UK, look at Brexit and Northern Ireland. I mean, in Northern Ireland, 20 years ago, you had bombing and killing on the streets of, and all of this has been washed away. The EU will not let this happen again. The Brits, the Conservatives were almost ready to let it happen again. They wanted the border to come back. Well, there is a cost to it to the UK, but Brexit is what they're going to pay. They may lose Northern Ireland. Everybody says it. If you go to the island of Ireland today, if you interview scholars, if you interview activists, if you go and talk to people, they'll tell you Northern Ireland is going to come back. They've lost the vote. I mean, these are really difficult questions, but they are right in our face. So the West on that front is really very, very strong. I think it's beyond, in a way, resources. It's a battle of ideas. And I think that the historical trend is towards that evolution. Anyway, John, this is what guides borders in globalization research. It's looking at this minority population, these cross-border communities, and trying to understand, what is the historical direction that they're taking. That's why I said to you earlier, we want to give voice to those people. Right? So people in Donbass today, look at the political clout they have. They've said, fight for us, and look at the results. People in Crimea, everybody says the vote was, just made up. Same.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah.
I'm not really an expert on the questions, I'm sorry if my question is a bit off topic. But you've been talking about mediating peace and the fact that countries such as China and India are not necessarily taking part. I was wondering, what about Turkey? Because I feel like France and Germany have clearly lost their privileged position as mediating partners, like mediating between Ukraine and Russia, especially Germany. I don't feel like the Normandy format is really in place anymore. Like, this doesn't function anymore, I feel. And I see Turkey as one of the winning parties in this war. They're almost instrumentalizing it to come back on the international scene as like a real diplomatic actor. And I was wondering, is that just a facade and an instrumentalization, or do you really think it's the first step towards peace mediation processes?
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you, but I think Turkey is, in a way, just playing the game extremely well. But Turkey, why is it in that position? Turkey is, in a way, a dash in between two blocks, but it's still in NATO, right? So it's the NATO country the closest to Russia, if you want. Yet it still sells arms to Ukraine. So because of that geopolitical location, Turkey can play, and because of relationships that they've had, trade, in particularly trade relationships, they can play that game. But they don't play to the benefits of either partners. They play to their benefit. And I think everybody around the table, including the Russians, when they look at Turkey, they think, okay, you play this well, it's your position. And they serve a purpose. So you say it's instrumentalized, but yes, it's actually for Turkey to play that game as in between, the diplomat in between. is very good for Turkey. It's not very good for either blocks, right? For the Russians, or it's not, but it serves extremely well Turkey. So in that way, they gain a form of neutrality, but they allow for some deals, for instance, the grain deal, to go through.
Yeah, of course. So do you believe it's just a facade, or is it? I mean, even if it is beneficial for Turkey mainly, it is still a way. Do you think it's still a platform to talk, or is it absolutely just a game, as you would say? I'm just wondering, like, is it just going to stop now?
Does this finally raise the issue of the values of NATO? Or when we talk about in a mechanistic way of enlarging NATO, it's about can Turkey have a real perspective within NATO? It did not perspective to become a really democratic state.
Well, Turkey, you know, to illustrate this, Turkey opposed the two new members in NATO. Yeah. Very clearly, they stood and said, we're going to go together, unless you do this and that for us. That's the only way they could sell it to the Russians. But think about it. That narrow perspective, that specifically Turkish perspective, protects them. It's like the Russians say, oh yeah, if you can get this out, we understand why you would let it happen.
That's it. Yeah. I'm quite skeptical of Turkey as a mediator, and for a very simple reason. I don't think great powers negotiate through intermediaries.
Yeah. They're not.
They're not going to do that. And they just, I mean, Turkey is a minor power compared to Russia or the United States. And I just don't think that either country will accept that. Finally, and certainly not with Erdogan and various levels of trust with Erdogan. So the reality is that the actual negotiation is always going to be between the Americans, the Europeans, and the Russians. That's it. There's no alternative. There's no alternative to that discussion. And I think that's, again, we have to be very clear-eyed about that. It doesn't mean that the first discussion is in Geneva with a lot of cameras, but in the end, the discussion is between the Europeans, the Americans, and the Russians. And that is just like, as simple as it gets. The Chinese cannot mediate, the Turks cannot mediate, the Indians cannot mediate. I just don't believe that it's either system will allow it.
A very important factor and a reason why it's not possible is the factor of trust. There's no trust regarding Turkey. And so we may not forget the friendship between Erdogan and Putin. They play a game. And Turkey is just, yes, temporary possibility. And this is why Ukraine agreed on this compromise or agreed on Turkish, let's say, negotiations and support. It's very temporary, but it's not for the future.
No, I mean, no durable, what I mean is that no durable agreement will come from the intermediation of anyone, including the UN. It's the format, whatever format is to be determined, I don't know. And by what channels and how to develop it, this is really the art of the process, and who are the architects of that, what type of channels can be developed, you know, that might lead to formal discussions. This is really, you know, of course, highly sensitive, and I honestly would not be surprised if it's already ongoing at some level. That depends. I don't know the attitudes inside of each of the governments.
But options have been on the table, John, right? I mean, people have talked about 7 years. Do you know what the 7 years thing? Well, I read it in Foreign Affairs. So the discussions that I've heard is that there is no NATO membership for Ukraine if it wins the war for 7 years. But Crimea would come back then. That's the options that are on the table.
Yeah, I have three questions, or three questions. The first one is about just a question about the nuclear issue, because you have not touched on this. Talking about the poor economic power of Russia in terms of population, but what about its nuclear power and about the nuclear threat? So I think that is an important issue. The second question is moving a little bit back on the migration issue. Because this panel was also about migration questions, and my question is the following: is that Putin has aimed at destabilizing the European Union with the Ukrainian refugees. And this did not function. Then he was trying to do it with the hunger issue so that the refugees would come floating in from Africa again. We have seen this. This is a question I know that Katarzyna has worked on this, using refugees as a weapon or as a strategy in war. That's a second question, to criminalization or human beings as a war strategy. And the third question is a German question. It's because we have this thing in Germany, and those who are a bit older, like me already, you know, with regard to the young students here, we were convinced, pacifists, and thinking, with the slogan, Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen. You could have peace without weapons, yeah. And now, I mean, the whole German ideology of Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, the Green Party has been leadership on this, has completely collapsed. So we are sending weapons, we are thinking, you know, war strategies, we can win, and we have to. So we are in a complete. We are not at all anymore in this idea. But do you think that the idea is lost forever, or is there not, because, you know, apparently when John tried to talk about just détente, it was not even Frieden schaffen, it was just détente. Katarzyna said, "Oh no, this is not possible." As a Polish reaction, I would say. What do you think of this? Just what did you have?
That's a very good issue. Maybe when we concentrate on this, then we have separate.
Three big questions.
No, there was a big question because the Greens would only have to buy weapons and pay for it. They also re-initiative atomic plants. So it's really a big issue for them. Okay, 3 questions from Birte. Who would like to?
Should we divide the questions, or should we all of us answer?
Yeah, not half an hour, because they will have their update.
Maybe you answer all of them.
Yes, very many analyses that the first political analysis say, yes, it's a very clear danger, it's realistic danger, and we have to think about possible scenarios, how to react to really nuclear danger and possibility in Europe. The other analysts who say, no, this is a Russian threat and it's not realistic and no signs, and these are mostly Northern American analyses that say, no, such a scenario is not realistic for the moment of nuclear war and nothing will happen. So I don't know. I have just presented two options, two different way of thinking. Second, yes, Jutta, and you, this is what you have clearly said. Putin uses refugees not for the first time. When we think about Kosovo and other cases, Putin uses refugees in order to destabilize Europe, because he knows, he has seen the blocks that have developed in Europe because of the refugees support, welcoming and not, and how many, and so on, so on. And Putin is still using it now in the way that he has destroyed houses and infrastructure, and so he has produced even more refugees movements, and he knows that this will be something that Europe will not have enough sources to support so many refugees. So the movement now, the wave now is not the last one. We will experience another one because of yes, what has happened in Kiev, and other places. And yes, I have to say this is naive, Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, a very German way, a very nice way, but not realistic. And this is, yes, what Paul said, multi-cultures criticized, but not only. Sweden and above all Finland. Finland that for a long period, Finland is neutral country and very cautious regarding first in the past the relations to the Soviet Union, later on relations to Russia, but Finland very cautious and very diplomatic, different from the Polish way, because Poles were always very clear regarding Russia and anti-Russian, but feels prepared for the war. Yes, there are bunkers in the whole Helsinki for more people that live in Helsinki. So Finland is prepared for the war. And Finnish analysts say very many Europeans and above all Germany has been very naive. And Finnish politicians and analysts make jokes about Germans are not prepared for with a very old-fashioned, I don't know, masks and everything that is related to the war. Yes, so no, it's not possible for the future this way.
I won't speak too much. On nuclear, it would have been possible if China had been in favor, but they pulled out and they made it very clear. Right? Xi's just been reappointed for 5 years. And one of the first statements that he had was to say that they would not be, I mean, he's against basically nuclear use of even strategic weapons. He doesn't want food to be used as well as a weapon of war. It has too many implications. So I think it's really important to realize this. There's still a lot of experts in the US who believe that it's a possibility. But most people agree that it's unlikely to happen. Like, you know, I'd say 98% possible that that's the. And so the way I see this is that Russia thought that it would be possible eventually, but it's being taken into a vice between China and the NATO position, which is led by the US. But now that China has taken these, has made those positions very clear, also that the top ambassador who has engineered the relationship between China and Russia has been demoted, right? He's not in the diplomatic corps anymore. He's been moved into an information communication agency. And the relationship with Putin has been lowered, right? So the Chinese thought that, it's very important to see how this plays in China, but China basically wants to, in a way, contain that war for very simple reasons. It has a cost. And Chinese and the Chinese diplomacy has always been a rebirth of China as a world power that is respected. They will not change all this. So I think this is quite clear that that's the line. Energy. So hunger issue and refugees have failed. Energy may surprise us, but I don't know. I trust the Germans are going to be strong. And then on peace without weapons, come on. If you go to China today, and you know I keep on speaking about them, but they're the rising power for sure. They're everywhere. They have invested trillions of euros across the world to make the Belt and Road Initiative a success. They have 65 agreements with states that involve control of security and transportation infrastructure, very deep into those states. They own harbors, including in the EU, privately, including Haifa in Israel. I mean, some strategic positions are everywhere because of the Chinese. So I said, but the Chinese are very keen on having possibly the strongest army in the world. So there will not be ever peace without weapons, but no nuclear weapons. John.
Yeah, so I won't be long at all. The first is, I think the China point is very well taken and has all the implications that I mentioned for the Ukraine war, right? The second, is actually turn the question back to my German friends. I mean, do you think that Germany is at a crossroads? And for me, when I look at Germany, I'm not an expert, and I'm learning as much as I can about Germany as fast as I can since I moved to this area. But I think, first of all, you have this question that you're raising about the foreign policy posture. And then you have the internal question. I mean, if the Vox party wins in Spain in the next election, which the polls say that they will probably win, you have, of course, the Fratelli Italiani in Italy. We have Brexit. Of course, we know the position of Marine Le Pen in this country. We know the position in Czech Republic. We know the situation in Hungary. Like, Germany does not live on an island. It does not live on an island. And it cannot but be affected by the same currents as all the other Western countries. So this is my question for my German friends, is like, where do you think the country is going? And how can, you know, those of us on the outside, you know, be a positive influence in the direction that you would, you know, the right direction, so to speak. I don't know enough about Germany to say. So stop that.
I was involved in the budgetary negotiations, just a small example.
Yeah.
There used to be a specific commission for the local authorities for their priority projects. None of the projects of the local communities has been accepted by the Ministry of Finance, because it was all about sharing the consequences of the refugee and the energy crisis. And this will wake up, people will wake up next year and will realize there is no improvement in kindergarten, nothing in schools, etc., etc., etc. Just to give you an idea, all daycare in school would amount up to 300 million euro in Baden-Württemberg only. And the Ministry of Finance finally agreed on 20 million. This gives you a certain idea of what challenge we may face, and it's just Poland in Germany for the moment who take the most of the consequences of this refugee situation. Like France has 40,000 refugees in Ukraine. In Germany, we talk about millions that will come, and winter has just started. So I'm not very optimistic on this, and will lead to an uprise of right-wing political parties in Germany. This is exactly what Putin plays on. This is exactly it. Europe is not united. Europe is very much divided on this issue. And we will have to see what will happen. A bit skeptical, but maybe we have some more optimistic consequences to share.
I think the aggression of Russia towards the Ukraine was a really game changer also in Germany, for Germany, because until then, under the 16 years under Merkel government, we had, you know, this saying of Wandel durch Handel. We said we may be in a situation to change Russia and other countries, the European Union, if we just involve all these countries in a lot of trade, in economic trade. And Germany, as you know, is extremely strong within the EU. I think we have 27% of the GDP, and at least of the budget we pay. So if you talk about Europe, you have to involve Germany. Germany is, I think, changing, and as well under Merkel. I mean, it's our now foreign president Steinmeier, who was a foreign secretary, foreign affairs, that he tried to find a peaceful solution by kind of sacrificing Crimea to Russia, which was not well received by the Ukrainians, and I fully understand that. I think this option is off the table, but at least there was they tried to find some type of a solution. It would be probably at the end a frozen conflict anyway, with the Crimea, something like we have in Transnistria, so where nothing really moves, and there are Russian troops there. But experience Putin now, we know that he would never be satisfied with it. He would accept it for the moment. It's a victory for him, but it's not his final goal. He wants to expand, bring back Russia to its old glory, and that's his destiny. So things are changing, but I fully agree that Europe must be in the on the negotiation table together with the United States. Otherwise, nothing will really happen. And I think to a good extent, the European Union came more together due to this conflict than we ever thought. Because until then, Europe was very divided. Yes, we still have some states like Hungary who are kind of doing their own game. But if you look at Poland, suddenly Poland is the wonder child, I would say, of Europe, and fully supportive. Before the conflict, Poland was not at least the Polish government was not such in favor of the European Union. They want to again also have their own little game, and therefore we have to count on Europe and Europe has to come together even closer, and that is France, Germany, and all the others together.
Look at the France news in France, television news. After the weather forecast, now we have a traffic lamp, green, yellow, red. It's about the availability of electricity. It's green, and gas. But what happens if it turns red? It will turn red, and that plans of the government that in certain areas there will be no electricity. And my electricity provider, who runs the technical infrastructure for the university, announced already that in February or so we will have no more, etc. But we have not experienced the consequences of what's really going on. This will happen in January and February. It will be extremely interesting to see the reaction. And I'm not optimistic because we are not united in Europe on this question. It's easy to say we are close. Well, we have now an energy bilateral agreement between France and Germany. Yes. Let's see. It's not, you know, how much the big economy in Germany is consuming in terms of energy and gas. So that's why I'm normally a very optimistic person, but there I'm really. I don't want to give the mot la fin, but I want to give an optimist up there. Just a few words. So I think the idea that Europe is not united is too well known. The reason we know how Europe is not united, it's continually in the media, especially the Anglophone media. And there is a reason to this, is that everything that is being discussed in Brussels is always in the media. But that kind of disagreement happens in every single federal country or similar system in the world. Watch the United States. Much of it is behind doors, and much of it is not actually so open to the media as it is the case in Europe. Because the European Commission has always published every single document. Not every government does this. So we should also have trust that the EU governments, in the case of this crisis, right, will be as divided as they have been in the face of the economic crisis, Brexit, and COVID. Because each time was supposed to be the demise of the European Union and their membership. And each time it failed, because each time the EU and the EU member states in the end came together. Look at, for instance, you know, the next generation, budget, right? Which all of the member states pulled together, even Germany was against it, but all the member states came together to borrow money on the international community together, and they were very successful. Right, it's 500 million, right, of euros, so almost $1 trillion. I mean, altogether the budget is what, 1.2 trillion. Half of it was borrowed. And Germany was against it at first, and then said, yes, let's do it. So we should trust in the future. No,
okay, I think this is thank the moderators and the panel. This was a really passionate debate. I would also like to thank the students.